There's a group of people that nobody's talking to. They didn't leave God, they left the building, and there's a difference. They're too wounded to go back to church, but they're too faithful to walk away from God. And right now, they're sitting in a gap that nobody has built a bridge across. I'm a licensed therapist and ordained minister. I've served in ministry for a number of years, and this video is for people who are in that gap. If that's you, I see you, and you're not alone, and I even understand that gap. The church has a category for people who believe. They're called members. And the world has a category for people who don't. They're called secular. But there is no category for people who believe but can't belong. Nobody's built that room. You didn't lose your faith, you lost your community. You lost the place where faith was supposed to be practiced, but the faith itself, it's still there. It shows up at 2 a.m. when you can't sleep and you find yourself praying, even when you're angry at God or don't understand. It shows up when you hear a familiar song or a hymn in a store or on the radio or on an MP3 player or something else, and then your eyes fill up before you can stop. Your faith is alive, your trust is just broken. And those aren't the same thing. But the church treats them like they are. If you're not in the building, you must not believe. And if you left, you must have lost your faith. Anybody hear that? I've heard that before. If you're questioning God, you must be backsliding. And so what happens is the very people who need the most care get labeled as the ones who walked away. You didn't walk away. You were walked away from. The institution failed you. Maybe the leader harmed you. Maybe the community chose the system over you as a person. And then they called your departure a faith problem when it actually may have been a safety decision. Let me tell you what's actually happening to the people I sit with, because it's not what a lot of pastors and clergy think. When someone is wounded by a church, the injury isn't just relational. It's not just that my feelings were hurt. It's a disruption that occurs at the level of the sacred. The place where a person experienced God becomes the place where they've experienced harm. And now those two things are fused together. Church and pain, faith and danger, community and betrayal. Your nervous system links them, and now every time you think about going back, even to a different church, or maybe going and visiting years later, your body says no before your mind can override it. That's not a lack of faith, that's a trauma response. Your body is protecting you from the place that hurt you. And it doesn't distinguish between the church that did the harm and the church down the street that didn't. Because the architecture is the same, the songs are the same, the authority structure may even be the same. And your nervous system says, I've been here before, and it wasn't safe. So the wounded person sits at home on a Sunday morning, not because they don't believe, but because their body won't let them walk back into the room where the wound happened. So if a church isn't safe, then why not just go secular? Find a therapist who doesn't talk about God. Join a community that doesn't pray. Process the wound in a space that has nothing to do with faith. Some people do that, and it helps. Therapy outside of faith can be valuable, and I'll never tell somebody otherwise. But for a lot of people in this gap, something is missing in the secular space. Because the wound happened in the sacred context, and healing it requires somebody who understands that context. A secular therapist can help us process betrayal. But if the betrayal was wrapped in scripture, spoken from a pulpit, done with liturgy, backed by thus saith the Lord, you need someone who can unwrap the theology from the trauma, not just the psychology. You need someone who can say, what your pastor told you was not what God said. The interpretation was wrong. You need someone to say that particular use of scripture was abusive in nature and abusive to you. You need someone with enough theological understanding to separate the wound from the word. And many secular spaces can't do that, not because they're bad, it's just because it's not their lane. So then you end up stuck. Too wounded for the place that speaks your language and too faithful for the place that doesn't. If you're in that gap, I want you to hear me clearly. You deserve a space that holds both your faith and your pain without asking you to choose between them. You deserve to be angry at the church and still pray. You deserve to doubt what you were taught and still believe in something bigger. You deserve to sit at a table where your questions aren't threats and your tears aren't weakness and your story is not an inconvenience. You deserve people who can sit with you in the mess without trying to fix you in the first 5 minutes. People who won't quote Bible scriptures at your pain because they've actually listened to what happened to you. You deserve a faith that has room for your whole self, including the parts that are still bleeding and the parts that aren't quite understood. That's what I'm trying to build as a therapist and as a minister. And through something I'm developing called At the Table, a space for people exactly like you. People who are too wounded for church and too faithful for secular spaces. People who need a seat at a table where the welcome is the point. Because the building doesn't make it sacred. The welcome does. Next week, I'm going to go deeper into what spiritual trauma actually does to our relationship with God. Not just the relationship with church, but with God. Because the wound doesn't just affect where you worship, it affects how you pray, whether you trust, and whether you believe you are heard. Subscribe so you don't miss. Take care.